which they focus more on emotions and sentiments compared to logic and rational thought. So today we're going to be looking at that side. They do happen simultaneously as a kind of reaction to each other. And the Picturesque really begins with this text, which is called The Origins of the Sublime and the Beautiful by Edmund Burke, in which he basically describes our feelings and our emotions as having two kind of peaks, one of them being peaked by things that are beautiful, so it makes us feel good, serene, calm, and the other side of it being things that are sublime and make us feel more uneasy, afraid, scared, etc. And this first manifests itself in painting. So the idea of the picturesque is to capture something in a way that looks like it's straight from a picture, straight from a painting. And the first place, at least in the built environment, the first place where we see the picturesque actually be used is in natural landscapes or gardens. So the landscape is the first place where they try out these ideas. They've used both beautiful and picturesque ideas to formulate these different moments. So the idea of these gardens is that you can walk around them, and as you walk around, it is composed of pictures or images of things that are either beautiful or are sublime. And the idea is to have you go through this kind of emotional roller coaster. Remember at the time, it's still really unsafe to do any type of long journey, even to get outside of your palace, your castle walls, wherever you're living. So the landscape, being a private place, is safe, and it's a place where you can experience the ups and downs of the beautiful and the sublime. So just to give you an idea, the first place where we see it in the non-built environment is in art. So these are Claude Lorraine paintings, the next couple of these, and they pretty much embody what it means to be beautiful. And as you can see, usually they have very soft either sunsets or sunrise lighting, very pastoral scenes. So the idea that you can have this more traditional occupation, right? Someone that's a shepherd with their sheep is something that's timeless. And then we usually have classical ruins in the back. So if you see anything that looks Roman, Greek, it's probably going to be more of a beautiful painting. Same goes with this one. So even though its shadows are a little bit harsher because it is midday, it is still a very serene painting, right? It makes you feel kind of good, kind of relaxed when you look at it. And same with this one. So there's this idea of hope that comes from beauty. Then on the other hand, we have what we call the sublime, which is really personified by Friedrich's paintings. So in this case, you can see it's still a natural setting, but the way that it's composed does make us feel a little bit more uneasy. So the tree, first of all, is fallen, right? So it tells us about how dangerous nature can potentially be. The idea is that you're gonna pretty much walk through that crevice that's there, but it's really dark, it's very narrow. There's a sort of mystery about what's around that corner that makes you feel uneasy. And this pretty much embodies what it is to be sublime. Then you have these mountains in the back that are just towering, and it makes you think about the scale of humans and how small we are, compared to something like this, where even though it is immense, it feels very open, right? It feels inviting. It doesn't feel like there could be something lurking in the background that's gonna try to get you. This is another example of a sublime painting. Usually they have very jagged edges, very sharp. Again, they're trying to use these elements in order to make you feel uneasy. And in this case, you can see there's even a ship over here, which if you kind of fill in the blanks, they probably ran into some ice, sank, and then they probably all died out here. And what we see architecturally in these paintings is that the Gothic, this is where the Gothic begins to become creepy, right? So in the modern day, when people think of Gothic architecture, Gothic ruins, when we talked about the Gothic, remember it's this idea of creating heaven on earth with beautiful lighting. It's a very calm place. But it's during this time period that the Gothic has this sort of shift to become a more creepy type of architecture. And the paintings that they create really help emphasize that, right? So in this case, we have these kind of monks going into these ruins, and there's this sort of mystery: why are they there? Why are they in this kind of ruined old cathedral? And the monk becomes associated again with this kind of terrorizing figure, which is quite appropriate given that in the northern So in Northern paintings, when they begin to depict the Gothic and the images of people from the Catholic Church, they do depict them usually associated to the sublime, right? There's this kind of mystery about what they're actually doing. So just to contrast, that's the actual Gothic, right? We looked at La Chapelle, skeletonized walls, lots of color, very beautiful space. And then this is the Gothic of the early 19th century or late 18th century in the way it was depicted. Very different, and this is really where that shift happens. So keep that in the back of your mind. Classical ruins, right? Greek, Roman architecture is beautiful, and then Gothic architecture is more of the sublime. And to reference our cover image, now you can finally begin to understand why these two things are separated as they are, right? So notice the way in which this side is composed. It's very beautiful, it has lots of light, very soft pastel colors. There's people in it, right? It's populated. Whereas on the left in the shadows is our Gothic cathedral. So it's using elements of the beautiful and the sublime all in the same painting. So the first type of landscape where we see this is what we call an English stroll garden, which is a very particular type of garden. Essentially, it's this big path that you walk on, and then as you're walking down the path, you're going to come upon different follies, which are going to be either beautiful or sublime. So it's the idea that you go from one picture to another. So the paintings that we just looked at could all very easily exist within a singular garden. And everything about this garden is completely artificial. So we're going to look at a couple right now, and you might think that they look like they're part of the natural setting, but everything down to the bushes, the trees, absolutely everything is artificial. Even the lakes were not actually there when these gardens were created. So keep that in mind. They're using nature to frame certain views, to create certain scenes, to create certain feelings for you to encounter as you walk around. Follies are basically, there isn't really a certain definition for it because they're all a little different, but they're basically these little built things, like imagine a bunch of little sheds. And they could take a number of different forms. They could be towers, bridges, temples, ruins, whatever. And usually they're placed along the way as kind of points of interest, and they're framed, right? So if we go back to these images, the classic ones especially, notice how there's just kind of a small ruin up there. In an English stroll garden, we would call that a folly, just something that's there along the way. Notice that it's framed very beautiful, it's up top, it's there for you to look at. So in the same way, that's basically what the English stroll garden is going to try to do. So I'm going to show you a partie really quickly so you can understand the concept. So usually you have a big manor, a house, a palace, which is indicated up there. And then you have this path, which is where you're going to walk along. Usually inside that path, there's going to be some kind of water body, and again, it is completely artificial. This lake doesn't usually exist there in the first place. And then all of these trees, notice that they do frame the pathway really nicely, right? So naturally, that wouldn't actually happen, but because it is all designed by hand, they do plant these clusters of trees so that as you come along right here, for example, you're in between trees, it might be a little bit more sublime, and then as you come into this area, notice that there is a clearing, so you have a very nice framed view of the lake, and then of the folly. So all of these are little follies, and as you walk, and as the curvature and the angle in which you approach these changes, they begin to come into view until you have that desired picture moment that the designer created. So we're going to look at, I believe, 3 English stroll gardens today. We're going to start with Stourhead. So you can see the main residence is up here. Usually they have some kind of like formal Versailles type of garden right next to them, but then afterwards it became very popular to add the large English stroll garden. So the best way to describe it is kind of like the Disneyland of their time, like a private little Disneyland that you could have with all these little attractions along the way. So think of how in Disneyland, when you walk around, you have all these really nice framed views, and it is all, again, completely artificial. The lake is artificial, but it looks like it's part of this kind of natural landscape. Same thing applies to these gardens. So this is one of those clearings, right? So you might have at some point had trees on both sides, but then you reach this area, and you can promenade along the lake over here, and then notice what's being framed in the background, right? So we have our bridge, We have an obelisk. We do have a temple to Apollo up here, and then we have another little Doric temple over here. And as you take these different paths, there might be a path to go up into this one. It would frame them differently, right? And they could change very easily to be from being sublime elements to being beautiful elements, depending on the moments that you encounter them in. So in real life, it looks like this, right? So it's still very well preserved. You can see our bridge in the background, which is going to be a point of reference for this lecture. So the bridge is going to be over here, just keep that in mind. And then we have our little Doric temple and the obelisk back here. There is that little Doric temple as a close-up. They are very small. They're usually not meant to be entered. They're just meant to be seen, right? And this is where usually gentlemen or ladies who were practicing painting, because that was a common pastime during their day, would sit around here, and then they would just create this beautiful painting with a little temple in the background. And you would never know that it's actually an English stroll garden. You might think it is an actual ruin in Greece or in Rome with the way that they painted it. So it's a fantasy land that essentially allows them to escape to these different eras, to these different cultures, all in one garden. As we're on the other side of that bridge, you can look over there and notice that now we have a Roman temple on the other hand, right? And notice that it is on this really beautiful manicured lawn, right? It's on this mound. It's a little bit up high. There are no trees in front of it so that it isn't blocked, so that we, as we stand on this side, as we go over that bridge, could be able to see it framed very nicely back there. Then notice over here, there is a little cottage that is a Gothic cottage. And notice that the Gothic cottage is actually covered because, again, the Gothic is sublime. So you're going to want to use a lot of trees to cover it up, to make it look a little bit more mysterious, more eerie. This is that Gothic cottage. This is a really weird image. It kind of almost looks like it's AI, but it's the only good one I could find of it. But this is what the Gothic cottage looks like, right? So as you come over here, notice that they do have a lot of trees kind of come over that cottage, so that behind it you get these really, really harsh shadows. So there is this element of mystery as to what is going on behind this Gothic cottage. Up high, there is that temple of Apollo, right? Apollo is usually a symbol of virtue, so they do want to put him higher up on a hill, very nice and visible. It looks like our Tempietto that we looked at just 2 weeks ago, so they're reviving a lot of these little prototypes, making them more of a miniature scale, and then propping them up around the garden. There is a close-up, and you would probably have to take some sort of path around the hill to kind of get up into this space. And they would have picnics, they would invite their friends over. It was very much a leisurely garden. Now, if we're standing on that bridge, right, and you look across this way, there is another example of a ruin right there. And at first, it's a little bit difficult to tell what it is, but I'll show it to you. So as we're standing on that side of the lake, would you guys see that this is more beautiful or more sublime?
In the back.
Hmm?
In the back.
No, just this general scene. Is it beautiful or sublime?
Sublime.
You guys think it's sublime?
Because it's more hidden.
So it's actually meant to be more of a beautiful scene. It's just that England is very gloomy, so it might look that way. But it's meant to be a very beautiful scene. The type of tree cover that they use in that area, notice, is very dainty. These trees are very skinny, so you can easily see through them. There's no mystery as to what's behind them. And then you have this really nice meadow and then the lake, right? There's really nothing that's impeding you from looking around. But as you can see, just overhead, we are beginning to have this element of the sublime just over here, right? So you just have to turn around, and that's one picture moment. You turn around 90 degrees, and you get this other picture moment right here. So this is the actual sublime over here. So now that you see both of them next to each other, I think you can see it a little bit better. Then if you look at this over here, we have this kind of mysterious little doorway. And you don't really have a choice but to go through it, right? So assuming you go through that, and then you continue going, you eventually reach this. It's this little cave. So you get a last glimpse of the lake over here, and then you're just kind of forced to go in there, right? You don't really have a choice. There's no other path. So it's inviting you to now have a sublime moment as you kind of went through that archway, and now you're going to go into who knows where. So excuse the Google Maps because it is dark. And you come upon this over here, which is this. And notice, this is what we call a grotto, right? So it is an artificial grotto that's made to look like it's part of the natural landscape that you just happen to wander across. And as you come in here, it's framing our bridge back there, right? So again, everything is artificial and designed to give you all these beautiful pictures or sublime pictures as you walk along the garden. And then because that 3D was really dark, I did want to show you what it looks like on the inside. So we do have this kind of natural rock-looking piece. And notice that it isn't made of these really nice stones, right? They make it look all porous, and it's made to look like this was just naturally carved out of whatever was there, which it wasn't, right? These are all artificially made. That is, of course, an artificial opening that frames exactly what the designer wanted it to frame. We do have a little skylight up here, and notice you can see the ribbing of the structure, right? So as much as they're trying to cover this up with all these stones and irregular shapes to make it look as though it's not planned, you as future architects can probably tell that it is. And then in the back, we do have a statue of a water god. So it's this kind of little mystery grotto that if we go back to this image, you wouldn't be able to tell what it is. But now that you've been there, you can tell exactly what that grotto is inside, right? So there was that beautiful moment that we looked at. Then there's that ruined archway where it turns sublime. And notice the way in which the trees change from this area to this area. It's much denser where it's meant to be sublime in order to give us those shadow qualities. Now, we're gonna hop over to another one. This is at Blenheim Palace. We looked at Blenheim last week, and I told you it was the last example of the English Baroque. It was really rejected after this, so we're not really gonna talk about the building, but we're gonna talk about its gardens. But just as a refresher, so you have a visual connection to what I'm talking about. That was Blenheim Palace from last week. Now, this is the palace itself. Notice that on its backside over here are its formal gardens. So again, in the style of Versailles, you have these triviums, these three-point nodal, very nicely configured geometric shapes. But then if you look up here where we have this lake, we begin to see that it's starting to look a little bit more organic or natural. But of course, all of this is completely artificial as well. So we're going to be taking a look at their gardens, which are located more so in this area. And then all of this is going to be more of a pastoral landscape. So that's where they're going to keep their livestock, their sheep. But I'll show you what they did with them. So this is the lake. And as you look back to the house, you can see it's very neatly framed. They did part those trees for a reason, so that as you're standing on this side, it frames the home and it doesn't cover it up right there. They do have a bridge of their own as well. And in this case, we have a very beautiful scene here, but that could very quickly change depending on the time of day, and it could become a very sublime element as well. So if it's a very, foggy morning, it's now all of a sudden a very sublime bridge. And the designer knows that, right? He knows how the people that live in the house like to stroll around, and so he curates these moments. The landscape architect creates them so that as they go about their day or about the seasons, they will have a good mix of both the beautiful and the sublime available to them. Now, in the landscapes beyond, we have what I told you were the pastoral landscapes. So we have sheep, there's cattle or cows, we also have goats somewhere. Now, if you know anything about animals, they do like to wander everywhere, and that can be a problem if you have a bunch of fancy people strolling around their garden. You don't want to have the sheep close to them. Number one, because it's going to smell, and number two, because of the manure, right? So what they do is this really interesting technique called a ha-ha, which you can see just right here. So I'll show you a diagram. So the idea of the ha-ha works like this. So rather than putting up a wall between the people and the sheep, they do this kind of ditch so that the sheep will be visible from the house, right? But if they try to go down there, there's no way that they could then climb up that wall and get into the side where the people are. So So if you're standing from the side in Blenheim Palace, you can't tell that this wall is here. And it creates this illusion that the landscape is just infinite and it goes on forever, and there's just sheep in the background that, for whatever reason, don't get close to the house. But if you look at it from the sheep side, you clearly saw that little wall just behind them over here. So you can see a bit of the haha right there.
Basically a zoo trench.
Yeah. And notice that the side where Blenheim Palace is higher. So for the people out here, as they look up this way, it's invisible to them. For them, it's just this really beautiful rolling landscape. And they're trying to recreate the drawings or the paintings of Claude Lorraine, where you have these pastoral scenes with the sheep in the morning where the sun rises. That's basically what they're creating here, just very artificially. Next up, we have a French example. So eventually this catches on. In England, it's obviously known as the English stroll garden, but elsewhere, in France, it's called the Jardin Anglais, which basically means English garden in French. It's very much the same concept. It's these picturesque moments that you want to frame as you go. And the one I'm going to show you today actually belongs to the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. So when we talked about absolutism, I told you that she had a specific place in Versailles where she would like to go play pretend that she was a milkmaid, that she was a commoner. So this is where that happens. Basically, King Louis XVI decides to give her this gift. And it's basically an entire little palace all for herself and for her friends to live in, and it comes with all of these grounds, which she then creates part of it to become an English garden. So I'll show it to you really quickly, just so you get a sense of the scale and how far it is from Versailles itself. So this is the entirety of Versailles over here, right? This is the palace itself, right there. And then the Queen's residence is this area over here. So this is going to be her section. This is her little home, the Petit Trianon over here, actually. And it's this little house where she can go live and be away from the king. So it was not a love match, as you can imagine. And Marie Antoinette, I've studied her extensively. She basically came to court when she was like 14 years old. And she, like most queens at the time, were just kind of treated as a person to breed the future king. So they didn't really have a lot of fun at court for the most part. The king did have like his own mistresses, who he slept with while the queen lived there. So she preferred to just live on her own with her court. She, of course, also probably took a separate lover. But in these two paintings, I'm showing you Marie Antoinette when she's at Versailles, which you can see is very formal. She has her robe à la Française, which is the formal French gown with the big corset and the panniers on both sides. Very expensive silks, very stuffy, very Baroque, right? And then on the right is the personality that she takes on when she's in her personal home in the Petit Trianon. So this is a more of a chemise type of gown, right? So at the time, when people wore underwear, they wore something similar to this underneath those gowns. So when she commissioned this painting, she was actually considered to be very scandalous, and people began to have these rumors that she's a harlot and a prostitute that came from Austria just because she dressed like this. But from the image, what I want you to gather here is the way in which she's shown herself to be amongst nature, much softer textiles, right? She looks like she belongs in one of those pastoral landscapes. So this is her dual personality, and when she moves into Petit Trianon, this is what she wants to emphasize. This is the image of herself that she wants to put on. So this is her personal little palace that she has. You can see it's a much more humble scale than Versailles. It doesn't look anywhere as ostentatious as that. She has her nice garden in the front, and then her little English stroll garden is in the back, right? So she has her own personal lake. It's pretty small compared to the ones we just saw. So the beautiful is right next to the sublime in this case. She has a little grotto like the one we just looked at. But aside from that, she also has what we call le hamel, or her hamlet. So in her hamlet is where she goes and she plays pretend with all of her ladies-in-waiting, her courtiers, her friends, and they play at being people in a village, right? So one day they can be bakers, another day they can be working on a loom, or most famously, they can be milkmaids. And this is where the story where she asks for a white cow that is freshly washed and smells like honey so that she can milk it comes in, right? She doesn't want to be around stinky cows. So you can see this one especially has a very Disneyland-esque quality to it. It is all, of course, completely artificial as well. Notice that they try to make it look like it's this really charming, rustic, medieval cottage. They even have the water mill right here. But if you look closely at it, it's not grimy at all, right? It's made to look like it's been deteriorated, but in an actual medieval home or a cottage where they did heavy labor, all of the stone would be black at this point, right? From all the weathering, from all of the dirt and the mud on the streets, but this is very clean in comparison. Her staircases up to her little tower are all decorated with flowers, which of course requires someone to be constantly taking care of the landscape in order for it to stay this beautiful and have all these seasonal flowers. Down below are her stables where she can keep her white cows. So it's a very beautiful scene, and this is where she spends most of her time. She specifically asks for an English stroll garden because she wants to have this sense of excitement, even if it's still in the confines of Versailles. So she doesn't want to be in the gilded Hall of Mirrors all day or in that massive promenade. She wants something that's going to pique her interest, that's going to excite her, that's going to give her some more emotions as she goes about her day. And the English stroll garden does that for her. So aside from the follies that we've looked at, right, so we saw grotto, a bridge, little temples, obelisks, we also have a new introduction of East Asian and Islamic architecture to Europe. So at this point, they're beginning to have a lot of trade. They're bringing back a lot of China goods, and they're trying to create follies that are imitating what they see in Asian countries. So in Kew Gardens, we see that they're using Chinese architecture, or what they call Chinese architecture, and then they're using a little bit of Japanese influence, Islamic influence. For the most part, they are not going to be correct. They didn't really care to study the actual forms and the decoration of these foreign countries that well. They more so just created it to what their imagination of Asia was. So I want you to keep these in the back of your mind because they're going to influence a larger style. So up until this point, we've pretty much been looking at paintings and landscape. So now we're going to get into architecture. How does the picturesque influence what's going to be going on in the singular building? So this is kind of our roadmap that we've been going on, right? So we have our origins of the sublime and the beautiful, manifested into the beautiful and sublime arts, and then both of these pieces can be seen in English stroll gardens. So both of these can exist simultaneously in a landscape. But in a building, it's really hard to have both sublime and beautiful. So typically they are separated and you either go very beautiful or you go very sublime. So on the beautiful side, we have what we call romantic classicism. So after they tried to revive all these capital N neoclassical, like true to antiquities of Athens ruins, they're now trying to apply these sensibilities to the rational, and they create what we call romantic classicism. Romantic because it's part of what we call a larger romantic era, but also because it kind of romanticizes the beauty of classical architecture in a way that's very different from what we've seen. Then we have Gothic revival. So this is one of the revivals that we're going to look at today, and this is of course going to be our sublime element, right? Gothic is sublime. And then the last thing that comes out of these as a direct kind of cause and effect of the follies we just looked at is what we call exoticism. And then keep in mind, of course, that all at the same time, we still have antiquities of Athens, and we have the primitive huts influencing these three. So these three texts are playing very large roles in the architecture of these three styles. So we're going to start with Romantic Classicism. So it's basically classicism that has a injection of sensibilities of the picturesque. So they want to create these beautiful framed moments, and they do that with their site planning, they do that with the type of decoration they use. So the typical characteristics are going to be massive scale, right? You want to have something that's going to blow your mind out of they want to have classical forms stripped down to the basic geometries. So they don't want to have all the nitty-gritty detail. They more so want the idea of classical architecture. And I'll show it to you in a second because it's kind of confusing. They abstract their detail, and then lastly, scenographic site planning, which I would argue is probably the most important part to all this. And by that, I mean they don't just kind of plot the building on the site right in the middle. They do pay special attention to how is the person going to approach the site. Are they coming in from the side? Are they coming in from a 3/4 angle? And then depending on how you approach the site, you're going to twist or you're going to anchor your building in different ways to get that correct picture as you approach it. And then with our second one, we see they're stripping it down to basic geometry, so that would be a little bit more of the primitive hut coming through with these basic structural elements. Romantic Classicism is heavily inspired by these sketches. Does anyone know what building this is? We did look at it in this class during the Roman week.
Is that like a Constantine?
Yes, it's the Basilica of Constantine and Maxentius. It was the last forum that we looked at. These are plates by Piranesi. So Piranesi is known for these types of sketches, which are very sublime. He goes down to record what the ruins look like in Italy, and compared to Stuart and Revit's Antiquities of Athens, he's not documenting them for scientific purposes. He's documenting them for the elements of the sublime, right? He wants the emotionalism that comes from looking at the ruins of what once was a great empire. This one's a little bit more difficult to identify. Does anyone recognize it?
Looks like it has 3 levels, or is that 3 levels or 2?
It's actually one level, and then it just has rings inside of it. So these are actually the bats of Caracalla. So these are the bats that the emperor gave to Rome to kind of make them happy and not overthrow him. So this is what they look like during the early, or rather the late 18th century. And then anyone recognize that? That one should be pretty easy. What is that?
Titus?
Not Titus, but it is a triumphal arch. So this is actually Septimus Severus's. And notice that the arch is sunken, right? So the level with all debris, all of the trash that's been thrown on the ground over the years has kind of elevated the level of the city. So it's half sunken, which is kind of a sad image to think about, given that this was once a great arch to celebrate the triumphs of an emperor. He also has these images of different jails, right? Different scenes that he finds while he's in Italy, and all of these are going to directly influence Romantic Classicism. So now he's going to take the idea of the classics, and he's going to take this sense of longing for a better past when this was a grand empire, and it's going to be channeled into architecture. So if you pay attention to these 3 images, we're going to start with our capital ending classicism, which you can see is very correctly emulating the Corinthian order, right? So it has its correct entablature, its correct frieze, everything about this looks exactly as it would have in ancient Greece. And then our first phase of early Romantic Classicism, you can begin to see that the pilasters now have a 2D scroll, right? So instead of being a 3D ionic scroll on top, it is just this little 2D piece. The entablature is very simple, right? So we can still see elements of the classical, but they're being stripped down now. And then the last phase of Romantic Classicism looks like this, where there is no capital, there's no base, but if you look at it, there's just something about it that feels like it's classical architecture, right? So it's about that feeling and that emotion that it gives you, even though if you wanted to be very scientific about it, there's really nothing that's that classical about it. But it's the ideas that are there. So that's what we're going to be exploring for this first part of the class. And the first building we're going to look at is the Bank of England. So just like in the merchant cities of Italy, the bankers at the time did work from their private homes. In this case, it's kind of like a nice city mansion that's in the center of this block. But over time, as England begins to expand, as it gets overseas colonies like India at the time, you can see this little dotted line is the future extent And today, that's where the streets run. So they rectified this street to be able to fit the bank, they rectified the top street, and then they fully carved out the street over on the left. So the bank is very important, not just architecturally, but also as far as urban planning goes, because it does kind of mark where these streets are gonna go later down the line. And that's what it looks like eventually. So you can see it's very hodgepodgey, it does go through many different phases, and as it continues to expand, they continue bringing back the architect, Sir John Soane, to come and create all these additions, right? So now they need a new room, we're gonna add a new one, and then notice that it's very infill-y, right? So it's not this pretty alignment of grids. You can see that by the dates, right? So the red happens before that lilac purple, and then that happens before this yellow. So we can clearly see that the yellow is just kind of the leftover spaces that he didn't use in the red and the purple after the fact, which is why it's so kind of irregularly shaped. Today, not much of his work remains, but we do have this exterior wall. So they did have to redo it in a more modern fashion to have security, to have the space, which is why it's like 3 to 4 stories tall. But this wall is an original of Sir John Soane. And on it, you can begin to see a little bit of Romantic classicism. This is very early, so we still have a bit of the detail. But notice that on this corner, his famous corner, he is using a detached column, right? So he could have very easily left this as a round wall, but he wants to give it this element of classicism, to elevate it, to give it class. And so he recesses the wall and he puts these columns in with an entablature. So technically, the columns are doing their job, but they are not really needed, right? You could have just left it as a round wall. So he wants to kind of dress up the bank and make it seem a little bit more noble by using this language. And this is only the beginning. And notice that his entablature here is already beginning to look a little bit incorrect. It doesn't have all of the triglyphs that it would necessarily need. And as we go inside, that's really where we begin to see all of his Romantic classicism. So I want you to take a look at that dome, right? The dome is very similar to the Pantheon. It's the saucer dome with the little steps on the outside. You can't see it, they're right here. But notice that there's no coffers in there, right? So he's not trying to revive the way that it actually looked like, literally. He's instead deriving the ideas and putting them in a way that's very nostalgic almost. So it is just 2D lines and paintings that he's using. But again, he's stripping it down to the basic geometry of classical forms. So it's a cylinder, and then it has a half sphere on top of it. But there really is no other carving that goes into this space. So that's inside of it. Massive scale, right? Very plain. The classical detail is very stripped down. All of these are little pieces of painting, 2D, but you can clearly see where the structure is. So this is where I say that where a primitive hut is beginning to come in. They're not hiding what the actual structure of this thing is. This is another room. This is where I got that detail from. So he does take this a step further. And again, you can see he's completely stripping the base, the capital. There's no entablature. It's just kind of like the arch bleeds into the column. So we see the fluting of the column still, which gives us an idea that it's classical, and then the way that it has these rotundas. But there's really nowhere that, once you start looking up close, that you can actually pinpoint a piece of classical element in it. These are other cross sections that he makes. And because it's, as you saw, a very large building, you do need a lot of skylights, which is why he has domes everywhere in order to bring in the light. Here's another example. This is one of his earlier additions where you can see he's still using the idea of the pilaster, but notice the scale of the fluting here is very large. And then notice the geometries of the room are very, very clearly red, right? So he's not hiding anything. It's very different from the Baroque. It's very different from even the Gothic that we looked at. So you can clearly read we're in a cube of space, then there's a rectangle of space back there, there's a circle of space up there. And this is already beginning to hint to what will eventually become modernism. So as we begin to look at these next couple of weeks, I want you to keep the kind of typical image of modern architecture, the white boxy house, in the back of your mind, because we're already beginning to see the influences that will eventually create those forms. So we already see that stripped geometry over here. notice that the color, there is no color, right? Very minimal, it's just white. They're not using any fancy materials, any fancy stones. And because Johnstone does love the elements of the sublime that he saw in those paintings by Piranesi, or those sketches, he does commission, or he draws himself actually, this kind of ruined version of the Bank of England. So if you look at it, it's actually an axonometric, an exploded axon, but he does create it to look like it's been deteriorated and ruined. So he's using the imagination to create what it would look like 1,000 years later, right? So once it's in ruins, in the same way that the Roman ruins were during his time. The next piece we're going to look at, I think, shows Romantic Classicism perhaps a little bit better. So this is in Berlin. It's a very famous art museum. In plan, there's really nothing that new about it, right? So it has these two courtyards, very Renaissance in its alignment. It has these rooms en filade, which we take from Versailles. It has a rotunda in the center. And from the front, it looks quite classical, but I want you to notice how large this is, right? So this is the beginning of that massive scale, and then that circle we saw is sticking out right here, so that's its rotunda, which we'll look at in a second. From the outside, notice that they're using this stone over here, and it kind of resembles paintings on a wall. So the building is almost beginning to tell us what it's about. It's an art museum. We have this colossal colonnade with these huge columns. They don't look as large out here, but I'll show you an image in a second. And then the most important part of this building is its site planning. So I want you to notice that the building is slightly tilted over to the left instead of being perfectly aligned to the street. And then notice that this is the entire plot of land that they were given for the museum, this whole open space. And instead of putting the museum in the smack center like you would traditionally have done, they do put it all the way on the left end, facing the back of that street. Because for the designer, Schinkel, this was the most important approach right here. So as you came in through here, he wanted you to get this really beautiful image of the museum all the way back there. If it was right in front of you, there's no mystery to it, it's not as exciting, but this is where we get that element of the picturesque. He wants you to come in and have this framed view of his building. So there it is. As you come in, right, and you cross over the bridge, you see the museum in the background, and notice that it's not just sitting in front of you like a flat image, it is in the 3/4 profile, so they're taking hints from Greek site planning. Remember, the Greeks also kind of tilted their temples so that you would see it from that 3/4 view. And then notice what the landscape is doing. So there is a missing tree right here, but by leaving out that tree, now we have these two trees framing the front facade here, right? If the trees weren't there, it wouldn't be as framed. So the landscape is very important to his design as well. And then you have this open plaza, this really nice place to approach it from the front. And your angle begins to change as you get to the front of the building. So it's a very pretty picture that he makes within the urban landscape. So as you come around, it begins to be more of a 2D image in front of you. There is that close-up where the marble, or not the marble, but paintings in marble. And then as you go up the stairs, originally this was open. Today they did put a pane of glass behind these columns. But originally it was open, and you would come up behind here and notice the immense scale of these columns compared to the people, right? So you can now stand up here and look back at where you just walked through. It is a very, very immense space. But notice that it does have the elements of the Romantic, right? This is a very stripped down entablature. These are just very flat pieces up here. They're not as deeply carved as true coffers would be, right? So they're very low relief. And then within that central rotunda, you do have all these statues of different gods, which is very appropriate given that the original pantheon did the same thing, right? But notice up here, all these openings are just very kind of stripped down rectangles. There is no pediments, there is no column to frame them. The coffers themselves are very flat. We can tell that they're just plastered in. They're not actually carved with stone or anything like that. And then of course the massive scale. So generally, this is what happens to classicism during this time. I know it might look exactly the same as all the other classicism we've been looking at, but if you look at it more closely and try to find the details, you'll find that it's very difficult to pinpoint them because they're not there. Your mind plays tricks on you thinking that they're there because you're so used to looking at classical architecture, but when you look up close, they're really missing. And then the interior rooms you can begin to see do very much resemble a modern day museum, right? The windows are just punches in the wall, right? They're punched out. So you can begin to see even more of the origins of modernism in here. Now, we're now going to hop over to the sublime side of things and talk about Gothic revival. So Gothic revival has two sides to it. You don't have to necessarily memorize this, it's just to give you the facts. So on the one hand, you have people who revived it as a kind of fantasy image of trying to create these creepy settings, and they just did it for fun to have these medieval Gothic little cottages. But then on the other hand, you have the people that take it much more seriously. So the Gothic becomes this symbol of national heritage for different countries. Now, who remembers where the Gothic is actually from? What country is it actually from? Yeah, the Gothic is actually from France. And then Williamson, from your exam, is the guy who brings it over to England. But the English treat it as though it is their national style and it is part of their heritage. So they like to claim that they are the ones who invented the Gothic style, and they use it as this national style during the 19th century to create this image of the better days, the old days of England, right? And then, just for reference, if it has a K behind it, Gothic, it does refer to using the ornament on forms that aren't actually Gothic, right? So if you have a house, remember the original Gothic is just for cathedrals, but assuming you want to make a house that's Gothic, like the Victorian houses, then it would be called Gothic with a K. And it's just a way to differentiate it. So we're going to start with one of those fantasy dwellings. This is called Strawberry Hill. So this is made by someone that has a lot of influence in Parliament. So he is one of the lords, and he decides that he wants to have this kind of getaway villa house in the Gothic style. Now, you guys now know what the Gothic actually is. It's those tall, skeletonized verticality transformation of like the color buildings. But in this case, none of that's really happening, right? It's not very vertical, it's not very skeletonized, and there aren't very many stained glass windows. So none of those things are happening, and yet it still looks kind of Gothic. So this is what we would call Gothic with a K, where they're just borrowing the designs or the stylistic language and pasting it on a modern form.
And they're just doing some castle shape.
Yes, so they did throw in what we call a witch hat roof over here, so they're mixing in fantasy medieval dwellings as well, right? So castle, Gothic, witch houses, it's a fantasy house. In plan, you can see there's clearly nothing about this that's Gothic. It's not a Latin cross, and as far as we're concerned, if it's not a Latin cross, it's not really Gothic, right? So it's just a house, and it has all of these different rooms. It almost looks a little Carolingian if you look at some of these forms, but there's really nothing about it that's Gothic.
That's about a Greek cross chapel.
And so if we look at it, it's not symmetrical either, which tells us that they're not trying to create something in the classical or the Renaissance mode, because remember, symmetry, order, proportion, those are things we associate with the classical and therefore the beautiful. And in this case, it's completely asymmetrical. It has all these different pieces so that from the outside, it has this asymmetry to it, and therefore it plays more into that sublime Gothic feeling that they're trying to go for. Right, so we can clearly read there's just 2 floors on this, 3 if you count this over here. Rusticated base, piano nobile. So we're still borrowing elements from other styles. And then from here, it almost looks also very Disneyland-esque, right? So pretty much this entire lecture has a sort of Disneyland approach to what they're doing because it is so highly artificial and it doesn't actually belong there. On the inside, these are just square rooms, and then they just kind of plaster the ornament onto there. So in a true Gothic cathedral, all of this would be carved out of stone. They would be much taller. They wouldn't look like this. But here, it's a library, so they're just using it as a cute bookshelf that they can decorate. And in this room, they're trying to do fan vaulting, right? The fan vaults that go all the way to the top, part of the perpendicular face of the English Gothic. But it's, again, just a rectangle room, right? If you were to strip this away and take these away, it's just a big rectangular box. And then they just use plaster and they paint it gold, so it is very fake. So this is the one that it's trying to copy, if you guys remember that image. Now, on the other hand, I told you, there's the people who take all this Gothic stuff really seriously, so serious that they use it in their national buildings, right? So this is Westminster, which is the House of Parliament, and they decided to have this competition, and ultimately the Gothic style won. So there was a classical proposal, but they rejected it because they felt it was too Roman, and they wanted to do something that was more truly English and that would reflect all of their Englishness, which to them was, ironically, the French style, the Gothic. In plan, you can see there's, again, nothing really Gothic about this. It is just a huge building with a bunch of offices and meeting rooms. And then from the river, I'm sure you've all seen this image, it does look kind of Gothic, right? If you know the form, you know it's not, but the style and the ornamentation is there. So the reason that they're trying to do it is to allude to the better times, to the heritage, to what it truly meant to be English. So at this point, they're starting to have this kind of reaction against globalization, against what is beginning to look too modern to them, and they want to use something that they believe embodies what their essence is, right? Because they feel that they're losing it in the world that is becoming more and more connected.
And these are the fuckers we're trying to conquer the world.
Yeah. yeah. As they're trying to conquer the world, they're concerned about losing their English essence. So here is an elevation, and I want you to notice the strong horizontals, right? So notice the form is very much just an office building. So we have 1, 2, 3 stories of offices. We have a ground floor, and notice that these windows are not Lancet windows. They are not pointed windows. They're just square windows. They're normal windows with sashes that go all the way around so that everyone has a little window in their office. If you were to remove that center window right here, this element, it just looks like a normal office building, right? Just window after window after window. But by adding that little central pediment, if you will, right there, they're alluding to the Gothic language. They're trying to create this giant kind of skeletonized window over here. And then on the other side, this doesn't really look that Gothic, right? We actually haven't studied this style, but it is called Elizabethan, from the era of Queen Elizabeth or Shakespeare. This is what the architecture looked like. And you can see they're mixing styles. So they're not even reviving it in its true kind of pure essence. They're tying other things to it. So because the Elizabethan era is also an era that they feel is the height of true Englishness, and Shakespeare is from that era, they're trying to combine a little bit of that in there too. On the inside, it does kind of resemble an English cathedral, right? And then you have your chair for the king back there. And then we also begin to see in home decor that they have these wallpapers. So if you're trying to do a Victorian house, you can have these wall decorations, and then that would make it look even more Gothic, right? By the time you do get to Victorian high Gothic architecture, like the ones that are in San Francisco, that is what we consider high Gothic or Carpenter Gothic. So it's kind of far away from what we just saw, but it's just a kind of later edition of this stuff. So as time passes, the Gothic style begins to be played with a little bit more, and it just kind of becomes this fun style that you can adopt, and it isn't taken as seriously as Westminster took it. And lastly, we're going to talk about exoticism. So yes, as the English were worried about their national heritage, they were also plundering India and going all over Asia and trying to conquer pretty much the entire globe. And because of that, they do have a lot of new architectural references that unlock to them that they didn't know about previously. However, they don't take that architecture very seriously. For them, the only serious architecture is English or Gothic architecture. So So when they look at the architecture of these lands, they see it as more of a, again, a playhouse type of architecture. They adopt it not for their serious buildings, but they use it for their fun, leisurely buildings that don't really matter as much. So they use it for follies, or they're gonna use it in what we're gonna see is a pleasure palace. They do bring all of these different cultures, but chinoiserie is what they called Chinese stuff. And this refers to anything. The china plates that they bring, the idea of just dragons, red wallpaper, anything that you would think of as being stereotypically Asian or Chinese, they grouped all together and they just called it chinoiserie because they didn't really care enough to differentiate different cultures and much less the different elements within the same culture, right? So they just grouped it all together. And that's why this style is just called exoticism. So keep in mind it is called that because the English considered it exotic, right? Not because in the modern day historians consider it exotic. It's just the way that they perceived it back then. They thought that they were being exotic and special by borrowing from these cultures. So this is the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. Brighton is a vacation type of town, so it's right by the ocean. And the monarchs typically had a house out there, and in this case, they built a really large palace, which is called the Royal Pavilion. This king, I believe it was like Edward VII or something, he was especially known for having a lot of women, right? So he was a ladies' man. And that's what he would just be doing over here until Queen Victoria passed away, and then he would get the crown. But for the meantime, he was just kind of messing around all of Europe, including in Brighton. And this is the palace that he commissions, and he uses this exotic style, right, to make it look more fun. So he's not taking the style seriously, and instead he's applying it to a palace that he doesn't take seriously at all. It's just somewhere where he can have fun, which tells you how they perceived the cultures that they were conquering or trying to conquer in other areas of the globe, right? So you can see they're mixing elements of Indian or Mughal architecture, Islamic architecture. They're almost using like a little bit of Gothic in here. So it's really not correctly emulating any type of style. It's just copying a lot of things and putting them into the same building. And then the interiors where we really see this explosion of what they call the exoticism. So you can see that they're using these kind of palm tree motifs everywhere because those are found in India and the tropical zones and climates. Their walls over here, the paintings that they would have aren't going to be all of these serious Greek tragedies or Greek heroes and gods. They're instead going to be probably exotic women on the walls. And then they also use a lot of dragons in some rooms. So up here, notice that is a golden dragon. So this is what they would call chinoiserie, or just Chinese stuff that they didn't know what to do with, but they wanted it in their palace. So there's a close-up of the dragon.
Did they give that thing wings?
Yeah, they did. Because the European version of the dragon has wings, right? So it kind of looks like a cross between a European dragon and then what would be the traditional Chinese dragon. Then these are the lamps they use in a different room, and here you can see more of that stereotype of the red and gold Chinese wallpaper, right? And then somehow the roof looks like a piece from an Islamic mosque, so they're mixing and matching a lot of things without any care for where they come from. So there is more chinoiserie, right? And then what I want you to notice, which is where we're going to leave off so that we can start our lecture on Wednesday, is this little column over here, which is made of iron. Notice how skinny it is. At the time, iron, which we will talk about on Wednesday, was not accepted as a building material. Instead, they used it in here as a piece of an experiment to kind of test the limits of iron columns. So because they didn't want to use it in their real architecture, their official important architecture, they put it in this building, which again, they did not take seriously, just to test it out. And it has this really cool kind of palm tree look on top that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, but now that you have iron, you can just cast it into place. So that's going to be a sort of